Hi everyone. Thank you for joining our Healthcare and Life Science Industry Forum at the Data and AI Summit. I'm Michael Ortega from the Industry Marketing team at Databricks, and I'll be your host today. We have an amazing group of industry leaders here to share their perspectives on how data and AI are changing the way we develop new therapeutics, deliver care, and drive better patient outcomes. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to our first speaker, Michael Sanky.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Sanky, and I am the Global Industry Lead for Health and Life Sciences at Databricks. Some of you know us well, and some of you are new. We are the data and AI company. We have more than 5,000 customers globally, including many across health and life sciences, as we'll talk about in just a minute. The founders of Databricks created the open source project Apache Spark, and Databricks also is behind other popular open source projects, including Delta and MLflow. What's most exciting for us in health and life sciences at Databricks is how we get to work across the healthcare ecosystem and be in the co-pilot seat with all of you as we transform the industry with data and AI. Many of you are from companies that already work with us in some capacity, and many more are hopefully starting the journey. Today, we work with 9 of the top 10 global pharmaceutical manufacturers, 4 of the top 6 health insurers in the United States, and government agencies globally, like the NHS in the UK. The healthcare ecosystem is becoming more interconnected, and every stakeholder in healthcare is working with new types of data in meaningful ways. Providers are taking on risk, payers are driving clinical quality measures, pharmacies are personalizing patient engagement and messaging with social data. Government agencies globally are getting involved in telemedicine, testing, and contact tracing. And the life sciences industry now has access to whole genome sequencing data to make personalized medicine a reality. All of these initiatives require a modern data and AI platform to succeed. I want to highlight a few of the lasting trends from the ongoing pandemic as we're now dealing with COVID-19 in 2021. People may not necessarily think of it through the lens of real-world data and real-world evidence, but vaccine effectiveness and safety post-clinical trials are just that, and impacting all of us in massive ways. Every day, we're reading and learning more about vaccine effectiveness. For example, effectiveness relative to the duration of antibodies, as we now have real-world data beyond the duration of the original trials. Every day we're reading about vaccine safety, for example, with regard to blood clots, now that these vaccines have been administered to tens of millions of patients, which are more representative of society at large than the initial clinical trial populations. As the pandemic has impacted clinical trial enrollment and site visits, manufacturers are focusing additional efforts on real-world evidence, ranging from studies that are included in regulatory submissions as supportive evidence to external control arms, which are control cohorts outside of the traditional clinical trial setting. The benefits of such approaches include more robust data that often are more representative of society, which has a positive impact on inclusion and health equity, accelerated drug development timelines for life-saving medications, and post-approval an ongoing data mechanism to support the safety, efficacy, and the value of these interventions in the real world, which are critical to all stakeholders in our ecosystem, including payers, providers, and governments. Data and analytic platforms are essential to ensure the quality of real-world evidence generation. The second big trend, as we think about the impact of COVID-19 in 2021, centers around the ongoing displacement of care outside of traditional settings. This displacement is moving from ad hoc to a codified set of regulatory and business practices across the globe. In the United States, CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, has been improving hospitals under its rapidly growing Hospital at Home initiative. This initiative is designed to give hospitals new regulatory and reimbursement flexibility to treat patients from inside their homes. Data and technology are enabling this program. CMS will collect monitoring data on a daily basis, which is meant to track a variety of measures, including patient volumes, unanticipated mortality, and escalation rates. The Biden administration is looking to further cement and support this trend by proposing $400 billion to give the elderly more care at home rather than in institutions. This represents a substantial portion of the administration's $2.3 trillion infrastructure package and extends beyond hospital at home to a wide range of post-acute services. As care becomes more displaced, data platforms must enable timely collection, curation, analysis, and reporting to ensure healthcare delivery standards are met. The third big trend as we think about the impact of COVID-19 in 2021 is around digital engagement. Once again, data and technology are the enablers. Digital engagement both manifests itself in displacing existing healthcare services, for example, primary care moving from the office to telemedicine, and opens the door to an entirely new set of services focused on things like wearable devices that offer real-time tracking and personalized disease management. And like our other big trends, digital engagement crosses the healthcare ecosystem. Biopharma companies have launched digital health businesses focused on drug plus interventions, for example, digital weight loss programs. Organizations like Humana have created end-to-end clinical operating models centered around holistic member and patient engagement. And providers like Providence St. Joseph are focused on meeting patients where they are through digital population health programs. So what do we need to solve to meet the demands of real-world evidence, care displacement, and digital engagement? Unless you're working for a digital native company or are ahead of the curve, you likely are living with some degree of tech debt from legacy systems built for data warehousing and other purposes that simply don't serve a world of massive streaming unstructured data that are required for many of these use cases. These data silos are hard to integrate. Data engineers, data scientists, and business analysts often code in different languages, and data architectures rarely have complex machine learning workflows at the forefront. This is where Lakehouse comes in. Databricks is leading a massive paradigm shift in architecture, combining the best of breed of data warehouses and data lakes. Data warehouses have been around for decades. They are excellent for structured data with batch processing oriented predominantly towards business intelligence reporting. Data lakes, on the other hand, have been in our industry for about a decade. They solve the problems of data variety and velocity, enabling semi-structured, unstructured, and streaming data to reside in the same place. The problem is that many lakes became swamps, often lacking query performance, schema enforcement, ACID transaction guarantees, auditing, versioning, and fine-grained access controls. Databricks Lakehouse platform combines the low-cost, scalability, and flexibility of data lakes with the performance, reliability, and governance and quality of data warehouses. Delta underpins all of this, providing the ability to build these curated data lakes. Delta relies on Apache Spark and utilizes advanced caching and indexing methods to process all types of data at scale. And it includes capabilities missing from traditional data lakes, like schema enforcement and auditing and versioning and those fine-grained access controls. The Lakehouse supports all workloads, engineering, BI reporting, and machine learning on the same platform. The Lakehouse is based on open source and open standards to make it easy to work with existing tools and avoid proprietary formats. And for healthcare, the importance of this Lakehouse pattern is even more pronounced. Why is that the case? Well, when we think about the unique challenges of healthcare data, we have enormous data variety. It's estimated that 80% of medical data is unstructured. And this can take the form of even semi-structured data like text to image data for things like digital pathology. We also have this multi-stakeholder world that we talked about a little earlier with providers, for example, dealing with claims data for risk-sharing agreements and payers dealing with clinical data for quality measures. And what this results in is that all of these organizations are now dealing with more types of data, much of that data unstructured and unsupported by traditional data warehouses. We also have tremendous data velocity, so streaming data is critical for interventional care. Hours can mean the difference of life and death in the case of something like sepsis in the inpatient setting. Resource optimization for things like predicting ICU bed demand was highlighted during COVID. So having the ability to stream data in real time into the lakehouse is critical to ensure care delivery. The third area why this lakehouse pattern is so important is for data volume, being able to have the ability to process data at scale. And there's perhaps no greater example of this than with genomics data, where we've moved from genotyping, which typically represents around 0.1% of a person's DNA, to whole genome sequencing, which is 100% of a person's DNA. And we're now looking across hundreds of thousands of these whole genomes. And in order to create those association studies and tie that to phenotypic data and disease expression requires massive computational power. And that's where this lakehouse pattern really delivers value in areas like drug discovery. And the fourth area here is around data veracity. And the reality is that in health and life sciences, democratization of data requires governance. Clinical reproducibility is really important. Things like access controls to make sure that minimum use is satisfied are really important. And having the ability to audit the data and do versioning of the data is critical for quality of care. So all of these buckets, if you will, together really highlight the importance of the lakehouse pattern for health and life sciences. And with Health Lakehouse, ultimately, we're able to create this unified analytics platform that can ingest all types of different data at different cadences, process that data at scale, and then feed reproducible machine learning models. Most importantly, what this creates is business value supporting initiatives, including the ones that we discussed earlier around real-world evidence, care delivery, and displacement of care as we're seeing today, and digital patient engagement. Databricks' goal is to make this simple and easy for our customers. To that end, we have created a number of solution accelerators that provide the foundation and the code to put use cases into action, ranging from automating digital pathology tumor sizing to parsing HL7 clinical feeds. Please check them out, and we look forward to supporting you on your journey. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Michael. That was great. Now I'd like to pass it over to our keynoter for today's session, Carolyn Magill. Take it away.
Hello, I am Carolyn Magill, the CEO of Aetion, and I'm so pleased to be talking to you this afternoon about real-world evidence and to highlight, as I do so, the partnership that we have built with Databricks over the years. My background is primarily in the payer, at-risk provider, and data and technology spaces. I've spent the last 20 plus years thinking about how we can more effectively pay for healthcare so that it matches the impact that it has on our lives, just the way other industries tend to do that. So about half that time I was with United Health Group, where I led Medicare Advantage special needs plans for people with multiple chronic illnesses and people with limited incomes. And then the last decade, I was with a series of high growth tech startups, Evolent Health, which is a population health management company. And then I was the CEO of Remedy Partners, which is a bundled payments company, and now the CEO of Aetion. I'll start with sharing a bit about our North Star. And it is so simple. And yet, none of us yet have this. A world in which we know what health treatments work, for whom, and what we should pay for them. At Aetion, we pursue that North Star with our data science-driven technology. And at the end of the day, we care most about making a better decision and using our platform to do that. We take real-world data, which simply means healthcare data that reflects our everyday interactions with healthcare when we go to the hospital, when we visit our physicians. And with our platform, we transform that into evidence, regulatory grade evidence, to fuel decisions about what drugs to develop, where there are gaps in care, where to place a medication on a formulary. We do this for life sciences companies, for health plans, for at-risk providers, for regulators. And we do this globally. At the core of what we do is rigorous science, honed by our founders at Harvard Medical School. One of our founders, Sebastian Schneeweiss, is now the chairperson of pharmacoepidemiology and pharmacoeconomics at Harvard Med. Jeremy Rassin, who was his colleague there, is with us full time. That commitment to science is critical because we are taking data, and it could be in addition to claims or electronic medical record, patient-reported outcomes. It could be data from a registry, as an example. It could be from a wearable device. Maybe I have molecular data. We take those data and we transform it into what we call real-world evidence, another catchphrase that relates to the insights that we derive. And at Aetion on our platform, we are very committed to understanding where the data comes from, to applying the most robust methodology to transform that data into evidence and to use transparent methods so that others can replicate the studies, so that skeptics can try to poke holes or understand the assumptions that we made. Which confounding variables did we take into account? If someone takes a drug and on day 2, they have a hospitalization, does that hospitalization count against the total cost of care for caring for that individual or not? And the impact that that drug had, or the relationship between that drug and that hospitalization, likely depends on the kind of medication. Our platform is a place where we can make these assumptions very clearly. And when we make them at scale, they have tremendous impact on our understanding about which medications work best for which patient populations when, and how much we should pay for them. We are a platform that sits on top of these data sources. And the data sources you could think of coming from Optum, IQVIA, Flatiron, IBM Watson, Ontada. We have one consistent analytic approach that works across these different data sources. And that's critical because one data source in and of itself is likely not sufficient to answer all of our questions. And this is why FDA chose Aetion as a platform in the context of COVID-19, where the stakes arguably have never been higher in terms of ensuring that we have a reliable methodology to turn those data into evidence. And this quote from Dr. Amy Abernethy while she was there speaks to why FDA chose Aetion for this important work. And it's not enough to say we are establishing standards, we are committed to scientific rigor. FDA is using our platform on COVID. We need to ensure that if we are really committed to global standards for transforming data into evidence, we bring together a community of thought leaders and supporters and industry sponsors who buy into this approach, this methodology that we're using, the transparency and replicability that we bring to these kinds of analyses. Dr. Scott Gottlieb, former FDA commissioner on our board of directors, our investor community, which includes global biopharma manufacturers, health plans here in the United States, data aggregators, and others who are very committed to how we use data. Regulators, of course, and having global relationships. So not just here in the United States, but also in Europe and Asia. And then the partnerships we have with organizations like Databricks, which I'll talk to in just a moment, as well as the data providers themselves. We bundle those data into our platform so that we can create measures that are tailored to that underlying data source that maybe take into account the missingness of one data source versus another, or understanding when the same label for a field doesn't mean the same thing across different sources of data. We have no shortage of data today. Each of us here knows that all too well. And yet, a lot of the data goes unused. We are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on clinical trials. Healthcare spend is very difficult to manage, especially here in the United States, but honestly, worldwide, we suffer from these problems. And so with all of these data sources out there and all these analytics platforms, how can this still be the case? And you may notice as you read the newspaper every day, headlines that talk about travesties in healthcare, like the rising cost of drugs that make them unaffordable for various patient populations, or clinical trials that don't represent settings or populations that exist in the real world, people over the age of 65, people with different racial and ethnic backgrounds, women of childbearing age, kids under the age of 18, the list goes on. These are populations who aren't necessarily included, people who have different combinations of clinical trials. And then if you work for a pharma company or you work for a payer, you might be familiar with drugs coming on the market and not reaching expectations in terms of what they're indicated for. Or we sometimes see that drugs come to market and then they're used off-label because physicians start recognizing, hey, this medication would be more appropriate or as appropriate for people who have not just diabetes, but also heart failure. How can that be? Why wouldn't we know that during the development or the approval process? And then you also might be asking, okay, but why should I care? And is this really relevant to me? Well, take a second, walk down the hall, open your medicine cabinet. How many half-open pill bottles are in there? And if that's not true for you, then go to your mom and dad's house and check out theirs. How many times do we start a medical treatment and midway through realize it doesn't work for us? And what are the implications with respect to the progression of disease or symptoms that we experience, side effects we experience that maybe we never even had to expose our bodies to? These are the kinds of things that we endeavor to address by using real-world evidence more effectively across the continuum of designing treatments for healthcare, assessing them, testing them through the trial experience, taking them to regulators for approvals, putting them on the market, giving patients access to drugs via a formulary, supporting physicians and clinicians in understanding when to prescribe which treatment when. We're not the only ones who are onto this. Of the approvals that FDA gave in 2019, half of them included real-world evidence in their submissions, and that number jumped last year to nearly 80%. And we, of course, are partnered with them in that in the context of COVID-19, where they chose Aetion's platform to assess these data from disparate sources around the country at one analytic workflow to understand which treatments work best for which patient populations when. There are many applications for real-world evidence, and we often think of it as a continuum. We're on the low end of the spectrum. We're looking at data from the real world to just understand who's taking which medication and what's happening to them after they take a medication. We're using it to do safety research. As we get more sophisticated, we use real-world data to inform label expansions, to conduct external control arms, to measure the total cost of care. And when we become even more sophisticated, we're using it to support regulatory approvals, formulary optimization, value-based care, contracting, paying for outcomes. I'll give you some case studies in just a moment to bring that to life. And we could not do what we do without Databricks. And the value that we get from our partnership with Databricks and using Lakehouse is multifaceted. From a scalability perspective, it's reducing overhead in our data ingestion process. It's eliminating manual tasks for engineers and for scientists. It brings us faster performance. And it also can support on-prem capability to the extent that that's relevant. So let me share some case studies to bring home how exactly real-world evidence is having an impact for us in healthcare today. Here's an example from a drug company that had a medication supporting patients with multiple myeloma. In this example, they're using an external control arm, a control arm created through data to support the approval. In another example, we're using RWE to help us see what's happening with medications for populations who weren't represented in clinical trials. So you may know that children often don't participate in clinical trials. And here's a report based on research that researchers at McLean Hospital did using Aetion's platform to assess the impact of different ADHD medications in teens. Very valuable insights about which medications work best. And here's an example of work that we did with Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey, where they're using their own member data to inform understanding about which drugs work best for their patient populations when. And then this becomes the basis of conversations they have with manufacturers of drugs in the therapeutic class that they are trying to bring to their members. Another example is ICER, which is an assessment agency that is helping to assess the value, the impact that medications have on different patient populations. They're using Aetion's platform both at the time of a drug launch to understand that value, and then 24 months later. Okay, now that we have more real-world data, what's happening when people take that drug? And what does that mean in terms of the value of those medications? And at the end of the day, we want to use all of these insights collectively that we're doing for payers, that we're doing for manufacturers of drugs, and use that to inform public health policy so that we ensure people have access to the medications that work best when they need them. And you can see that there is a lot of support from within the regulator community. This is from Dr. Janet Woodcock, who's the acting commissioner of FDA, talking about the power of real-world evidence and how we need to use it more in our approvals and decision makings. But nothing is more compelling than appreciating something like what this picture represents, which is the first person receiving the Pfizer vaccine in the context of COVID-19. Because at the end of the day, we want to ensure that patients have access to the medications that work best for them when they need them. Thank you for your time, and thank you to Databricks for your partnership.
Thank you, Carolyn, for sharing all the great work that Aetion is doing in the community and the massive opportunity for real-world data to improve healthcare for us all. I'd like to now hand it back to Michael Sanky and our esteemed group of healthcare and life sciences leaders for today's panel discussion.
Welcome, everyone, to our Health and Life Sciences Industry Panel. My name is Mike Sanky, and I'm the Global Lead for Health and Life Sciences at Databricks. I'm thrilled to host this amazing panel representing diverse stakeholders across the healthcare ecosystem. We'll be discussing the opportunity for data and AI through the lens of a few of the lasting trends of this ongoing pandemic. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today. We're joined by Carolyn Magill, the Chief Executive Officer of Aetion, a healthcare technology company that provides decision-grade, real-world evidence solutions. Slawek Kierner, the Senior Vice President for Enterprise Data and Analytics at Humana, one of the largest health services companies in the United States. Deepak Sadagopan, the Senior Vice President for Value-Based Care and Population Health Informatics at Providence St. Joseph, a large health system with more than 50 hospitals that operates across 7 states. And Dr. John Scott, a physician informaticist at the Department of Veterans Affairs, working on the VA's data governance and data management strategy. Carolyn, Slawek, Deepak, Dr. Scott, welcome.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be with you.
We'll start our discussion today with real-world evidence, or RWE. Given the different vantage points across the panel, let's dive right in and learn more about the impact of RWE in your industries. Slawek, I know that one of the things you're passionate about is interoperability and data standards such as FHIR. Can you share how important these are in terms of generating reliable real-world evidence, and how Humana more broadly thinks about RWE from a payer perspective?
Well, thank you, Mike. And let me start it and then invite, of course, others to build on this point. But clearly, from our point of view, standardization of FHIR is just one of many very important avenues to complete health records of our members. There are so many new data sources that are emerging from all kinds of devices, Apple Watches, Fitbits, blood glucose meters, diet apps. All of those are emitting data right now. And of course, what we have learned is that the more data we have, the more accurate models we can create and provide more personalized, simpler care to our members. So this is huge for us, and we are a big proponent of bringing more and more standards, FHIR-based standards, to enable this data flow. Moreover, of course, there is a big need and big demand for opening up APIs, interoperability APIs between us and the providers of healthcare, such that we can advance our value-based models of care, and we are investing here a lot, as well as open, frankly, innovation in the market, which healthcare needs so much. The moment this FHIR APIs become open for all players in the industry, of course, innovation will accelerate, and I do hope for a lot of goodness to come from this. So our strategic vision is really to invest in interoperability, and we believe that this will, of course, provide more real-world evidence available to all the constituents, all the members of healthcare industry.
Great. So Deepak, one of the things that Slawek mentioned was value-based care, and I know that you're on the other side of that from the health system perspective. And one of the things that we've spoken about before in the context of RWE is the inherent tension between having more data and yet potentially less control over some of these confounding variables. So I'd love to know how this plays out at Providence St. Joseph's in terms of both standardizing the data across all the different facilities, and then maybe through the lens of value-based care, how you think about the role of RWE.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Slawek. I think the role that data plays in our ability to manage the health outcomes for populations cannot be overstated. I think it's a critical lifeline of how we manage populations, and I think we are in a time and space where provider organizations are increasingly being held accountable not only to quality outcomes, but quality at a particular cost, right? Like in terms of saying that you've got to be able to manage the health outcomes for a particular population within a particular cost budget at a particular level of quality that we expect. And that level of accountability would be almost impossible to fulfill unless we had real-time insights into how our populations were doing across the board, not only in terms of clinical state, which we have right now with electronic health records and health information exchanges, we have some insight into that. But I think the evolving part that is still being developed is how do payers and providers communicate with each other in this growing space, right? Like Slawek talked a little bit about FHIR standards. What I'm here to say is it's not only the exchange of clinical information between party A and B, it is also the automation that exists behind the scenes in administrative processes, being able to say, say that you're able to tell your clinicians participating in these programs that they have exceeded spending in one case, or they have underspent, they have underachieved on quality in other areas. Being able to provide that visibility into them real time, and also being able to tell them that this intervention that you put in place last month is not either showing results or outcomes, or is working. Real time and real world data is critical for us to be able to measure progress, and that's really what this is about. Ultimately, is how do we impact the experience of the patients we care for and we share a responsibility for between payers and providers and all the other entities contributing to this space.
That's a great segue to you, Dr. Scott. So how do you think about translating this from a population level down to an individual level in care delivery? Because you're thinking about this both at a data management governance level, but also thinking about the implications of treating patients.
Yeah, as Deepak was speaking, I was thinking about the particular perspective that I've had is as a clinician forced to use an EHR since I began my career. The burden that the EHR creates on the clinician and the challenge of being able to get the clinicians to be able to use the EHR to consistently enter the data that's necessary for the kinds of insights, especially real-time insights that Deepak was talking about. So at the large organization like the VA, how do we get our clinicians to use the EHR correctly? How do we tell that they did? How do we make it good enough for them to be able to do that so that we have consistently acquired the data that we can then look at to measure the actual value, whether they followed guidelines and followed the care pathways that we recommend. Trying to standardize the way the EHR works and make it work well enough for the clinicians, and at the same time, another current in medicine today is personalized care, account for variations that are appropriate at the individual patient level. How do you do both of those things well is, I think, a huge challenge for us and any other large healthcare organization. And you mentioned VA is both a payer and a provider. So we are needing to be able to look at the information we garner from the use of our EHR in our direct care system, but also in order to promote the VA as the best choice for veterans, we do need to be able to compare how the quality of the care inside the VA to the care that veterans get outside the VA. And that's an additional challenge because there are different types of data sets.
Carolyn, so you have a lot of past perspective from your work at United, managing health plans, at Evolent, serving health systems, and now at Aetion, which really has established itself as the leader in real world evidence. How do you think about the role that data and AI plays in enabling this space around RWE, and maybe some of the biggest changes that you've seen sort of in the evolution of RWE over the last few years?
Yeah, happy to speak to that. And you're right, we've actually seen a fair amount of change over the last 3 years in particular. So, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we saw some legislation that talked about real world evidence. So it introduced this notion of turning data that reflects our everyday lives in healthcare into insights that are actionable relative to how well drugs and clinical treatments work for different patient populations and in different settings. 3 years ago, we were explaining to people what RWD stood for, what RWE was and why it mattered, how it maybe was differentiated from some of our other approaches to analytics. Why do we need RWE if we have actuarial science? What do you mean? I already have a health economics team. Isn't that sufficient? What is truly differentiated about this? And I'd say back then too, to the extent that we were using real world evidence, it was primarily focused on safety. We were looking at medications as an example that had been on the market, and we were looking at the impact that a given drug might have on a patient population after taking that medication. And you fast forward a few years, now everybody's talking about real world data and real world evidence. So even, here, just representatives from the payer and provider communities help to underscore that notion. We're able now also to just access more data than we were historically. And we have better methodology for understanding data provenance and what to do with it. And we can be much more transparent with how we're identifying confounding variables and then how we're controlling for them and the implications of what we're controlling for on the results that we see. And that level of transparency is absolutely critical. So now we're at a place where regulators are actually making decisions on whether a drug is safe for a new population that wasn't represented in a clinical trial based off of real world evidence. And that's something we hadn't seen before. And the role of AI in this is helping us to identify patterns, to sift through large amounts of data. 3 years ago, when we were talking about real world data, we were thinking of claims, electronic medical record. Now you put on top of that patient reported outcomes, data from wearable devices, genomics data, molecular data. These are the kinds of things that just, we're talking petabytes, right? Like this is a lot of data at our fingertips. And without the advancements that we've seen in AI, we just wouldn't be able to sift through that in any systematic way. And now we're at a place where we can generate hypotheses to understand better what's happening with different populations. And then we can test it. We can test it with methodology like ours that is less black box than AI often is, but you have to start somewhere. And I'd say that's where it's had the biggest impact.
Yeah, I love it. If I can only add also the perspective of a patient or a member, a consumer here, which I think also will benefit. So we talked, of course, about all the important things for the development of new medicines or our providers and payers, but the moment more of this data is in circulation, the services that we have will be able to be way more personalized. And I soon see a crisis of how many of these different modes of getting healthcare exist, how many more apps and digital services are being created. That, of course, creates this paradigm of too much choice where people in the end don't select anything. And when we have more real-world evidence where we can actually employ models to personalize and help people with these choices, we hopefully can steer them to what actually works for a very particular case and lead them to better outcomes.
So this is where I start to get super passionate, Slawek, because the thing is, we talk about things like personalized medicine, and absolutely, let's give solutions that work on behalf of the patient and think about them holistically, right? As a former health plan leader, you're also trying to manage the medical loss ratio, and you're trying to understand how to deploy limited resources across a very needy population. And so one of the things that we're passionate about is, how do I know what's differentiated? And it's not just about personalizing, it's about figuring out what's different for group A versus group B that is truly driving meaningful differentiation in the outcomes of cost and quality that Deepak was talking about. And so how can we do that in a systematic way? So it's not necessarily a different approach for each member who's involved in a Humana health plan as an example, but we start to see better the kinds of interventions that actually drive meaningful impact for different groups of patients and members.
Yeah, and I think that something you said there, Carolyn, really spoke to me, which is that one of the things we consistently hear from our frontline caregivers is that we don't want to see and treat a Humana patient differently from a United patient, from a Blue Cross patient. They're patients. They all, to me, they want to practice payer agnostically, right? And that's one part. And the second part is what we're learning as we get deeper into some of the population health stuff is that, there are a lot of factors upstream that, we call social determinants of health and other kinds of factors that impact downstream healthcare outcomes. And I think the more we focus on integrating care delivery to care about the whole person and do that upfront and use that and be able to be prepared to react and have visibility to real-time information about that population, I think the better off we will be in achieving our eventual goal of having a healthcare system that is not spending 5 times as much as other countries. I think we've placed far too much burden on the back end of healthcare when conditions become serious and the acuity becomes higher than addressing wellness and whole person care up front. And I feel there's opportunity here for a private-public partnership to be able to frame policies in this area, to be able to really create products and services in this space that can really transform what we know to be healthcare delivery today.
And the VA has a tremendous opportunity to contribute in that regard, because it is a large organization with a health promotion mission. And in that mission, it not only has healthcare for 6.4 million veterans being delivered directly, it has a mission to promote health for veterans generally. So at the size that the VA is, and with the care relationship and beneficiary relationship that it has with its patients, and a drive to promote health, we should be able to put prevention and health promotion in the front of everything that we do, and be able to collect enough information and use it ethically in that mission to be able to make big data inferences on what types of care actually lead to the best outcomes. The VA tracks veterans for their entire life and gets a complete health record on every one of them from the DoD when they were younger and active duty service members. And it creates a tremendous opportunity to look at what predictors when they're younger and active duty are important to focus on as determinants of later outcomes. So it's a tremendous opportunity with VA right now. And if we can sort through the data management challenges, and being a big government bureaucracy makes that a little more difficult. But if we can sort through those, we can contribute significantly to the kinds of things that you're talking about, Deepak.
It's interesting, Dr. Scott, like there's a one region in our system, especially who's working with the Department of Defense, actually, interestingly, to provide a plan, just like you guys are. We are a combination of a plan and a delivery system too. And one of the plans and products we offer is actually for family members of Department of Defense personnel. And I think the partnership between the agencies and our team, our care delivery team, has really helped drive outcomes and lower costs of care for that segment of the population, and overall improve experience, and really thinking about primary care transformation has been at the heart of it, of placing primary care at the front and center of how care delivery is triaged.
Do you advise your beneficiaries who are also military beneficiaries to make use of the patient portal that they have access to from the military to acquire their entire health record and then share more of that with you? Because I'm a big proponent of patient-centered health information exchange, and DoD and VA both have pioneered patient portals and notes access, but we do not always make the most effective education and promotion of the services we create. So I'm a big proponent of anyone who is also providing care to service members and veterans to help them avail themselves of the patient portals and access that the departments are trying to give them. I think it's always going to be more robust means of information sharing than we will achieve, despite your work on the fire standards. We're never going to be able to share as much between healthcare systems as the patient can download from one and send to the other. And we can facilitate that transaction so it's not too much burden for the patient. Anyway, but there was a question there. Do you think about promoting that?
Well, most of our members in the U.S. Family Health Plan, as we call it, tends to be family members of serving professionals, personnel, not as much as the military personnel themselves.
The family members who had care in the military can use the same tools.
Yeah, and I'm not aware if they use their portal, but it's something that I'll look up and get back to you.
I'll send you the link.
Please do.
And Dr. Scott, maybe you could just spend another minute. How has that information sharing gone between the DoD and the VA? I know you're working on initiatives to get more predictive around adverse behavioral events, even suicide prevention. Can you share a little bit about that?
I've been thinking that there's three ways that we share information between healthcare systems, and I think DoD and VA are doing very well at two of them, but not the third one. We make viewers available for health information exchange, and the DoD and VA have a very comprehensive shared viewer system right now, so that every single bit of electronic information created by both departments' healthcare systems is viewable in an integrated viewer to the other department. So we've got a good viewer, but that puts burden on the clinician to do something with the information. We also have a pretty well operating document transfer system, if you will. When a service member separates, the entire health record is collated into a set of documents, because that's the evidence that the Veterans Benefits Administration needs. And they have a basically interface between the electronic filing cabinets. So we store the record, it gets copied into the VBA systems, and they have the entire record as a set of documents. That's working. But what isn't so good yet, and we're working on, is actually sharing data so that it can be used for analytics, so that it can contribute to clinical decision support systems in a more robust manner. That's where I think we're more at if we say crawl, walk, run stage. We're at crawl, maybe we're starting to walk a bit.
Right. There's one more thread I want to pull on a little bit on the RWE topic, and that's around the nature of representative patient populations. And Carolyn, you mentioned this in the context of RWD versus clinical trials and the opportunity to have these more inclusive patient populations in RWD. Can you expand on that a little bit? And then I'd like to hear from the others how you think about the patient populations respectively of Providence, St. Joseph, Humana, the VA, in terms of representativeness and sort of the opportunity there for RWE.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something we think a lot about. And to be fair, we don't say real world data versus RCT because we don't see them as sort of adversarial, if you will. We see them as supplemental to one another. And then oftentimes it's just not feasible to represent every setting, every population in a clinical trial. And so that's why we want to supplement those trials with data. And there are all kinds of examples of this. So oftentimes people over the age of 65, people with different combinations of chronic illnesses, women of childbearing age, people under the age of 18 are explicitly excluded from trials. So it's not until a medication is on the market that we're actually able to see what's happening for those populations. And then we have other examples, like with COVID-19 as an example, where we were running these clinical trials, but we were not getting diverse populations enrolled. And we needed to see, well, what's actually happening with African Americans as an example, Asian Americans who weren't necessarily adequately represented. And so we look to data to help us fill in those gaps in a much more systematic way. And this speaks to why FDA, as an example, chose to use our platform in the fight against COVID-19 and specifically wanted to look at data sources from different parts of the country to get a better sense, and looking at open claims as an example from a hospital setting, as much as they were looking at electronic medical records and then trying to understand which data are truly giving us incremental information that drives a different decision or tells us something meaningful about what's happening with those populations. And how can we ensure that we're applying methodology in a consistent enough way that our analytics can be replicated and there aren't any secrets about how we analyze those data to come up with those conclusions.
Any thoughts from the others in terms of how you think about representative data?
I would say, I'd agree, Carolyn. The challenge in what I would also add is that a RCT and the RCT mode of gathering data and evidence, while it's been time tested and it's like the ultimate manifestation of the scientific process that we've all grown to respect, is also time consuming, and it also involves a certain level of funding as a prerequisite to be able to do that. And that also leaves out, unfortunately, many of the other opportunities, like for interventions, that we're not able to put through the same rigor because we don't have funding to do that. Like, things like I would even taking another completely different example, out of the therapeutics or the medication context, simple things like, you change how you are redirecting the use of emergency departments for a segment of the population, and you're trying intervention A versus intervention B. I mean, there's no way you're going to get funding to run an RCT for something like that, or you're going to have, or even if you do, the results of such an RCT is going to take far too long for you to be able to make a determination on whether such interventions are effective. I think the RWE pathway of actually making care delivery, determining the efficacy of one care delivery intervention versus the other, can offer a viable alternate pathway for us to actually be more effective in implementation of value-based care, speaking from the world that I live in day to day, at least.
Yeah, if I can tag on, I think we need to have a portfolio of tools, and while at the same time, of course, allowing for more innovation and faster innovation cycle. Because that's what I think was kind of stopping us also in many of the RCTs, because it does take very long time to wait for the health outcomes. And then if we also base calculation of health outcomes on claims, we know that this process of claim adjudication does take sometimes even months. So that of course has prolonged this innovation cycle. So that's where RWE comes into place. But also thinking about leading indicators, which I think are very important for our industry, especially now when we are looking at social determinants of health that involve other forms of providing help to our members than just traditional healthcare, and then those types of health can be measured with indicators that are coming in a bit faster. And as long as we believe in the influence of healthy food on people's whole health, we can measure whether they actually did switch their diet and are exhibiting more healthier behaviors, and already take this into a bank of enough evidence to continue to invest in certain intervention. So what we are doing is we are building actually this library of leading indicators and looking way more into behavior change than waiting for all the way for the health outcomes of RCTs.
It seems to me when you're using RWE in the context that you're discussing it, Carolyn, that you've really got to be careful about what confounders there might be. For example, we're working with our cancer tracking system and providing a better data backend for them. And some of the things we've talked to them about are, say, a novel treatment for cancer and trying to compare the effectiveness of that of those who had that treatment and those who didn't. I think it's important perhaps to measure how engaged are the patients and consider that as a potential confounder. Maybe the patients who are signing up for the new treatment are simply more engaged in their care in general. And so we've got to, I mean, it's a new field for me, but you're nodding your head. I imagine that's a real trick to being able to use the RWE in this context.
Exactly. And one of the most important things we do along the way, John, is just be clear about the assumptions that we're making.
Yeah.
So that because it's not always possible to control for everything or to even think about everything. And then that leads to skepticism. And we saw things in the context of COVID as an example with retractions and very respected medical journals after having printed studies, real world data studies that were not conducted in a reliable way. And so there are examples out there that we have to ensure that we are very committed to addressing with a level of scientific rigor that makes the results credible. The more transparent we are about the assumptions that we make, the more confident people will have, especially stakeholders with different views, in aligning on the insights that you derive and say, yes, this is actually reliable. It's something that that we can all agree on.
Yeah, I talked with Mike in the prep for the panel. When we think about the VA, it's a huge population. You think of it as being cross-section of the U.S., but it's got certain skews. It's first of all, they were all in that military service, so that's not the entire good cross-section of the country. But then the ones that have their care in the VA, that's just 6.4 million out of the 24 million veterans that are alive. So which ones are getting care in the VA? There are people who had conditions that were related to their military service, first of all, and then the VA was their first choice. How representative is that of the American population? You have to consider all those potential skewing factors, even at a big population like the VA population.
Yeah, and even in sources of data. So, sometimes we're looking to assess, a rheumatoid arthritis drug or something, and people are saying, oh, we can get data from Fitbit. But it's the same thing. Well, who's wearing a Fitbit? Tends to be someone who's a little bit more active. So right away, that's skewing the results of your study. So absolutely being sure that we're using data that are fit for purpose of the question that we're trying to address is critical.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that notion that you initially articulated, Carolyn, that the RCT and the RWE are supplementary to each other. And I think probably we think of these as essential components of our evaluation process going forward, not one complete in and of itself. So,
which, by the way, brings us back to Databricks and using Lakehouse as
Mike's favorite topic there,
right? Well, but honestly, to digest different data sources and to do that in a systematic way, to have the level of performance that we need for this even to be possible.
Great close to the RWE topic. So let's transition a bit to our next theme around displacement of care. And by displacement of care, what we mean is care moving outside of traditional facility settings. And this is happening in the context of virtual care and telemedicine, which we'll address in a little more detail on our next theme around digital engagement. It's also happening in the context of acute hospital care being delivered at home, with CMS's Hospital at Home initiative as an example. And that doesn't even take into account the rising trend in post-acute home care and home services like home infusion, which are emerging. And the Biden administration earmarked $400 billion in its $2.3 trillion infrastructure plan around increasing care at home. So Slawek, maybe you can kick us off here again. Humana has been investing heavily in home-based care, most recently in acquiring all of Kindred. Can you tell us a little more about what Humana's vision is for at-home care and the role that data and AI play in achieving it?
Yeah, sure thing, Mike. And we of course are all super excited and proud and welcoming of this expansion of a company and all of the clinicians that are now joining us and through this turning a payer into clearly a healthcare services company led with by clinicians. There's going to be more clinicians at Humana than ever before, and that is certainly a response to a growing trend and clear demand from the market that care could be delivered at home. We see that those that are being taken care at home have 5 times essentially those that don't receive that care have 5 times more hospitalizations than those that do. So clearly there are health outcomes that are coming with this. And additionally, of course, clinicians, when they visit our members at home, they can see the whole setting. So it's not only what they see through a short visit in their office, they can see the whole setting of that member and we believe that is, of course, very valuable. But it's not only about this, care at home that we bank on. Actually, we really think about integration of all of our assets. So Humana, while operating the pharmacy, can of course bring pharmacists to the fore. We also have primary care, and as well as a number of other assets that all together can provide this holistic care, delivered both through digital means, telephone outreach, and when necessary, of course, in the home of our members. And of course, data is in the center of this. So when you think about this care at home models, you both have ability to acquire, process, and use way more different data assets than before. And also, in order for making this economical model work, we want to employ way more machine learning and prediction to know, with which type of help to outreach to our members, and then provide this care at home at the right time, at the right moment for the right member. All of this, still in context of ensuring that this experience for a person is simplified, personalized, and in the end leads to better health outcomes at lower cost.
Great. Deepak, when we've talked in the past, we've touched on some similar themes, and I know you have a concept around ubiquitous care, which is really about meeting the patient when and where they need it. Can you expand on that a little bit and tell us what Providence St. Joseph is doing in terms of programs to deliver on ubiquitous care?
Yeah, I think one of the things that dawned on us, especially for, over the past year, as we've been grappling with COVID and how it's impacted our different communities, one of the things we had worked on even prior to COVID, that it has been a heavy focus area for us, is expanding our digital footprint and capabilities, and really being able to provide for care virtually, and what we were experiencing before the COVID issues of last year was that the adoption of digital care was actually very minimal. And there was hardly any uptick there. And there was a period in the middle of last year when it went from 0 to about 4,000% or something crazy like that, where virtual care really skyrocketed, right? And the other area we've been focused on is home and community care, where we have a pretty large home and community care division that takes care of patients at home visits, at home different levels of acuity. We have a hospital at home program, and post-acute care, which is SNFs and skilled nursing facilities and things like that. One of the things that we have experienced, we've seen first at hand, and we've seen in data too, is that I think over 70% of the time, or something like that, in a recent study, if patients are given a preference of whether they want to be treated on an ongoing basis in an extended inpatient environment, or rather go home, or even for that matter, choose a more interventive treatment pathway versus choose a less aggressive treatment pathway, they always, when they are informed and empowered, and I use the word empowered to be able to make that choice, they actually choose the less aggressive and the more care at home pathway. And partly, we feel it's our calling to listen to our patients and really deliver care where they need it, where they feel more comfortable, and that affords a better healing pathway to their conditions. And from that perspective, what we've been looking at is this combination of a care delivery model that is equivalent no matter where you deliver care, whether it's wherever the patient is, bringing care to the patient, rather than this onerous system that we've created over the past multiple decades of having the patient navigate the complexity of the health system to find their way to you. And it's a huge.
Oops.
Oh no.
Wait.
I think
Tim?
Deepak you were frozen for a minute, Deepak.
Oh, did you guys lose me?
Just for 10 seconds or so.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I was just saying that, like the whole notion of bringing care to the patient rather than not waiting for the patient to find their way to you. And so as we deconstruct our health system as we know it and reconstruct it again, that's the experience that we want to design it around, is really how does the patient now care in a way that is simple, intuitive, and they're able to get care when and where they need it. So
great.
I know digital engagement we're going to talk about separately, but there's a tie-in to that conversation about the displaced care. And the traditional care, we rely heavily on the electronic health record, and the clinician using the electronic health record to provide the data that we then use to measure the outcomes. In the displaced care, it's harder to do that. And I think there becomes more of a reliance on the kind of data that comes from the devices. You're going to have devices that are involved in the home care. The mechanism by which that information is communicated to the healthcare system so it can be used as part of our analytics, that's where the overlap with digital engagement, I think, exists. Because we have to do that for whatever the patient wants to send us. The mechanisms by which we connect a patient at home and their devices to a data transmission that we can validate and aggregate at the healthcare system, I think that applies then to whatever partnerships exist for the people who do the home care and monitor those devices. We're not going to get those people to use our EHR, but we can probably get all that device data to flow through the same data technical connections to get it into our analytics platforms. At least that's how we're beginning to think about that in the VA, looking at the same mechanism where we put it together. I can't speak from experience. VA is so big. This is not an area I've studied of just how the VA is partnering to perform home care, but I know that will be a challenge for us as well.
Carolyn, how do you think displacement of care, sort of building on some of these comments, opens the door to additional data types that then can be used as part of these submission packages? And how should, whether it's the pharmaceutical industry generating evidence or regulators considering the evidence, think about, these new emerging data types driven by the different nature of the interactions?
Yeah, the displacement of care is something that is influencing the ways in which we look at patient populations and how we even define patient cohorts in really positive ways, because previously we're relying on data from claims that were created for billing purposes or from electronic medical records that were created for the purpose of delivering care. And those aren't necessarily reflective of whether I can walk up my stairs or whether I'm making it to the pharmacy to pick up my medication. And these are the kinds of things, or just how I'm, engaging in activities of daily living. These are the kinds of things that really are saying whether my quality of life is where I need it to be, relative to my own care goals. And so by having these additional settings, we're able to get a better picture. The trick is that we need to capture data in these settings, and we need to do it in a consistent way. Back when I was managing health plans for United Health Group many years ago, we really struggled with, data that was gathered in people's homes because there were inconsistencies in access to the internet, as an example, access to ways to transmit that data to us. And was the absence of that data reflective of, the capture not working correctly, or the fact that that wasn't existent in someone's life? There were all these questions. I think we've come a long way. The other challenge that we have today is around linking data. So how can we take the data that's reflected, in my home as an example, and combine that with what happened to me last year when I was at Providence in an inpatient setting? And how do I then combine that with the medications that I'm taking? So you start looking at people more holistically based on what they're experiencing with healthcare, regardless of that setting. And some of, the tokenization, we've made a lot of progress in that regard as well. So we're able to do that much more effectively now than maybe we were historically.
Yeah, go ahead, Slawek.
Maybe just to tag on, Mike, I think what will happen in many ways is we have this two segments of different needs. We have members that have internet in their home, that have onboarded to virtual care, and we have seen a huge spike of both telephonic visits during COVID, and some of this habit, of course, remains and will stay with us going forward, and that is great, and that generates a lot of data. And by the way, these people often have other devices in their homes, their home speakers that soon become enabled also with cameras and screens, and they listen all the time. So signal is being generated, and we can get a lot. We are innovating quite quickly here and hoping for all of the signal to help our predictive models. At the same time, there's also this other segment of members that don't have maybe that advanced technology at home, that might struggle even with internet connectivity, and we need to be there for them as well. Which clearly during the pandemic we've seen so many suffering from food insecurity because of transportation challenges, and even right now with vaccination drives, some are not able to properly use the portals, but you need to have access to be able to schedule your appointments. So we are doing tons of work in just outreaching through telephones and through this delivering meals. So we delivered more than 1.4 million meals this way, leveraging our data, our platforms, identifying those that might have food insecurity and calling to them. And similarly now with vaccinations, we're making more than 5,000 phone calls a day to help those that are in most need and maybe don't have access to technology the way we all do.
There's another trend, Mike, that's related to this, and that is virtual clinical trials. So it used to be that to conduct a clinical trial, we had to go into a setting and seek care in person, be monitored in person. And, this technology and practice has been around for a long time, but we hadn't really adopted it as an industry until COVID necessitated, because so many of us were homebound. And so I would expect to see more of that, so that the testing and the clinical trials happening in these more, varied settings.
I think the other thing that the experience of last year has taught us is this notion of agility in healthcare delivery systems that we've never thought of it that way. I mean, we think of healthcare delivery systems as these monolithic structures that is centered around these buildings of primary care and acute care services. But it was like when it came time for an emergency, and we ran short of hospital beds and critical care beds, we were able to be extremely innovative to be able to create those beds in a football stadium or like in other types of areas where the hospital, the traditional notions of a hospital doesn't exist, but we were able to move components of what represented care needed to be delivered at that point in time without incurring the fixed cost of actually creating a building. And there's something we take away from that experience that, and we've implemented several innovations in different parts of our system where we create like this mobile primary care vans where we actually take mobile healthcare to, places of employers or things like that, or communities where they're able to get their, primary care checkup, wellness check, things like that, or mental health checkups, mammograms, things like that happen on a remote setting that is not anchored to a fixed facility, but it's also meeting the community where they are, and I think innovations like that project the delivery of care towards where the patient is in their community, involving less fixed cost structure, as we've known to embrace the health system of today, I think is going to take us in a direction where we're able to ultimately see that goal that we all share of bending the cost curve of healthcare, but creating a more responsive health system for our community and populations.
And we're going to have to adapt the EHR to serve those care settings. The way in which the flow works in a hospital and who does what in terms of who does what bit of data entry has to be flexible enough to to still document care that takes place in those new different.
Talk about a fixed monolithic structure. I think that's the next big thing, is that the electronic health records that we know of today tend to be large things, right? That form the operating system of current health systems. I think it's time for us to really introspect on what an electronic health record really is, and how that needs to apply to this emerging models of care that we are seeing, and how do we leverage technologies that are cloud-centric, that are intimately tied to the agility that is represented by the cloud, and not tied just to a client-server architecture like we've seen over the past few decades.
And it's not just the technology. I think that the VA can enable a clinician to use a mobile device and enter information. It's the workflow. It's the workflow is, this person does the screening set of vital signs, and then the patient goes over there. That's inherently tied to the fixed facility mentality, and adapting the workflow is as much as having a mobile entry device for the information. It's a huge challenge. I mean, because it's hard enough to get the clinicians to use the thing correctly when you do have them all in a fixed facility and can go.
Yeah, and it's a combination. Actually, it's a combination of technology and that workflow that you referenced, Dr. Scott. Primarily because when you think of electronic health records today, these are entities that are implemented within the walls of a health system. They are implemented. So when you say that, let's say you implement a care innovation model like a mobile health van or something like that is co-owned between one health system and another partner in the community or something of that sort, right? It doesn't naturally lend itself to the same model that even if they had a mobile device to actually enter data, the architecture doesn't naturally lend itself to where it can support a cross-organization type partnership. Whereas an organization that is centered or natively a technology that is built on a cloud, natively built in a cloud, an application built like that. Take Google Docs as an example, right? I mean, if you want to create it, and like for this panel, Mike created a Google Doc and shared it with all of us. I mean, we were able to access it, view it, edit it, things like that. To be able to do that with an electronic health record is like getting a root canal right now.
Yeah, and it's not the technology; it's all the policy that makes sure the thing is a legal document at the same time as serving the data needs. That has to be flexible. And I'm probably in two of the most inflexible organizations. I was in DoD. I'm in VA now. Incredibly inflexible because we're not only HIPAA covered entities. We're federal health records manager or federal records manager. That policy.
I completely agree. I think it's a combination of everything. It's the whole ecosystem that we've created around a fixed healthcare delivery model that there needs to be a broader rethink of that. So.
And I would like to plug in still one thing here, which is technology can be the translator between these monoliths and the human. One thing that we are doing quite a bit right now with Databricks, frankly, and open source technologies is we are bringing way more natural language processing to analyzing of this electronic health records, both to distill features that then help us turn care from reactive to proactive. So that's a change from in the workflow and leveraging these assets that we can deploy in people's homes. But importantly, also for our nurses that are working hard in the pre-approval process. Right now, we can synthesize these docs so that they don't need to spend hours reading thousands of pages of documents for some of our members, but they can have things way better, more summarized, and by the way, from this perspective, also more consistent. So what we see, through this is we are eliminating, errors that could otherwise happen because AI today in many of these situations is way more accurate than humans, reading thousands of pages, and we can make it more equal. So we are employing a number of techniques that bring equity and responsible AI on top to make sure that all of these decisions are properly monitored and help. So this helps put something on top without maybe years that we would need to put into replace these monoliths that Deepak, you talked about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's just rapidly accelerating the cycles of sort of how quickly we've moved in terms of care displacement and digital engagement. So I was planning on sort of separating out digital engagement, but it came up so nicely organically in the conversation around care or displacement of care. I think we tackled a lot of it. So maybe to close out the panel today, I'd love to sort of have 60 seconds from each of you sharing what excites you most as you look out over the next year as technology continues to advance and enable new solutions. Carolyn, maybe we'll start with you.
Of course, you put me on the spot.
Put you on the spot.
Happy to. We've touched on a lot of the themes related to the things that we are most excited about over the next year. One of them, honestly, is more conversations like the one that we're having here today, where we have health systems connecting with payers, connecting with the pharma community, connecting with physicians to be able to represent how we can advance the ways in which we look to data and how we align on the evidence that we get, to drive better decisions. We've talked about things like the displacement of care and some of these other trends. They're here to stay. So let's evolve in terms of our looking to data to drive these decisions, doing that in a systematic way. And it does feel like we are finally at a place where the methodology and the technology can keep pace with these kinds of ideas.
Great. Dr. Scott?
What excites me most about the potential for the next 5 and 10 years is the revolution that is at hand with the patient being in control of their own data, right? And the legislation in the 21st Century Cures Act and the ONC new rules and the requirements of every healthcare system to make an entire set of electronic information available to the patient, plus the changes in culture and plus the technology that exists, enable the patient to be the aggregator and the communicator of their information. With a patient-controlled digital space, a personal health record that is empowered to get information from any care provider and then aggregate that. So getting from our last generation sorts of tethered personal health records to ones that really are what I'm talking about, I think is the opportunity. And if we fully seize that opportunity, it solves a lot of the problems we've been talking about, because the patient, creates the record. That's the complete record, plus the patient-generated data, plus devices that are connected to that. It's cloud-based, and then they send it with the standards you're working on to their healthcare system when they're going to have a healthcare visit. That's the opportunity, but I mean, there's a lot of challenges to that as well. One of which we touched on, it doesn't help the person who doesn't have internet connectivity and either a mobile phone or some type of more sophisticated, to push the buttons and do that aggregation and benefit from the data display. That sort of is the Achilles heel to what I'm talking about, but otherwise it helps a great deal and then enables care to truly be personalized when it's delivered that way. So that's what I'm most excited about.
Slawek?
Right. So, Mike, we talked about this for a while already. So we've just finished investment into our machine learning platform, which we call Florence AI, and that now hosts increasing amount of signals and data. We have more than 20,000 features. We started creating models there that are way more precise than anything we've seen before. So this year, the next year, is certainly a time for us to harvest a lot of improvement in terms of our ability to predict health events, predict needs of our members. And now when we couple this with the investment into home assets that we've just made, and also interoperability rules coming to action, all of this creates a little bit of this perfect storm of where we'll be able to provide more actionable care at home, simple, personalized, and the one that improves health outcomes of our members at way lower cost. It's exciting time.
Yeah, I'm most excited about the potential for transformation in our healthcare system overall to make it more responsive to our patients and empowering our caregivers to really practice innovative medicine, without being burdened by the administrative burdens that the recent environmental changes have come to place on their shoulders, and so that they have more time to invest in patient care. And I think the conversations that we're having today and more conversations like this that need to happen across the industry, and all the stuff that we're talking about, the interoperability work, the ability to use technology more so that information that is supplied to a caregiver, the tasks, the administrative tasks that they perform at their end are kind of absorbed by technology itself behind the scenes, and they focus more on care delivery, and the information they consume is meaningful and is curated through the use of advanced technology. I feel that's the calling of our generation as health information technologists, and I think there's never been a place or a time where I think there's a confluence of technology and readiness to embrace it that places us in a position to make that difference. So I'm hoping we can rise to that challenge.
Agreed. Well, thank you all for spending your time sharing your thoughts. Extremely thought-provoking. I'm optimistic about the future here, and I know that I'm excited and Databricks is excited to continue to partner with each of you on these journeys. So thanks again, and thank you to our audience for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that concludes our industry forum. Thank you all for tuning in, and make sure to stop by the Solution Theater for interactive demos on the most popular data and machine learning use cases in industry. Enjoy the rest of the summit.